Today we are interviewing Patrick E Kehoe, who is Professor Emeritus of Law at American University in Washington, D.C. Pat served as the director of the Law Library for 30 years before retiring in 2003. Pat, I believe that those watching or reading this interview would like to know a little bit about you personally. For example, could you begin by telling us about where you were raised and about your family and life both when you were young and today? Then perhaps you could tell us about your education, including where you went to college, law school, and then to library school.
Well, Michelle, I was raised in Seattle, Washington. My parents lived in a neighborhood that was actually just to the east of the University of Washington, where there was a law school and a law library program as well. My father was a lawyer. My mother was a stay-at-home mother. Wife was pretty much the common in the 40s and 50s when I was being raised. And more recently, I was married. I'm now a widower, but I was married to a woman, Carol Fitzgerald was her maiden name. Carol was a nurse and also taught at college level, as did I, for all of her career. We do have two children, a daughter who's now in her early 40s, and a son who's just about there. The daughter is married. She has a wonderful husband, David, and a grandson, Jonathan, who I love to spoil when I see him. They happen to live in Grand Rapids, and today after living here in the D.C. area and in New Haven and Houston before that, where I was working, Carol and I did return to the Pacific Northwest when we had both retired, which was a few years back. And I have a house in Olympia, Washington, which is the state capital, and about an hour's drive south of Seattle in that state. So that's pretty much what I have. I should mention maybe that my son, who is still a bachelor, does have a fiance, so perhaps a wedding will be in the future, within the year or so there.
Great. And then now perhaps you could tell us about your education, including where you went to college, law school, and library school.
Okay. I was sort of a stay-at-home student, living with my parents actually, although I spent a lot of time on the campus, but I was a commuter student. I did my undergraduate work at Seattle University and majored in business finance with an eye to, probably going into banking or something like that. Later, as I approached the law school period of my life, I was, I guess, my last year at Seattle U, I decided to sit for the LSAT. And the test was, if I did all right and could get into the University of Washington Law School, which is the only one to which I applied, I would go to law school and become a lawyer. And so I did. I passed with enough of a score, so I was able to be admitted, and started law school at that point, and thought that I would do the sort of traditional practice of law like my father was doing in his firm. In fact, he had at one point said I could come into the firm and, if I wanted to when I graduated, and so I had that option. As it turned out, however, I did decide to become a law librarian, and there's a bit of a story to that, which I'll tell in a few minutes, as I think it's a little different than a lot of our colleagues have had, and it's sort of interesting, at least in my opinion. But to complete my education, I did go to law school at the University of Washington, passed the bar exam, and was admitted to the practice of law, and then started library school the following year. But because I had taken the summer off to get ready and take the bar, it took me 2 academic years to finish library school because of the way the program was timed. I couldn't take certain courses until the following year. But there was an advantage to that, and this gets back to the personal, and that is that one of the rites of passage for graduate students, at least in that era, was that they had to have one or two modern foreign language capabilities, at least adequately enough to pass a reading test in the field. And so I was taking a course for graduate students one summer, trying to learn enough French to pass that exam. And I met my future wife in that class. She was in a doctoral program at the time. I was getting my master's in law librarianship. And so, we started to court, and then later we, of course, became married while I was working at the University of Houston some years later, or a year later. So that's sort of the educational background that I had.
Great. So now, could you focus on how it was that you decided to become a law librarian? I know that you started out as a student assistant at the library where Marian Gallagher was director. I assume she had some influence in your decision to become a full-fledged law librarian, and I hope that there were others as well.
Well, actually, Marian, of course, had some influence, but it was interesting how this all came about. As I had mentioned, I grew up near the University of Washington, and at that time, we had a lot of faculty members living in our neighborhood. And the next door neighbor to my parents' home was a man named George Stevens. George was the dean of the University of Washington School of Law. And one day in the late summer of the year I was 15 years old, Marian Gallagher, the director of the library, the head law librarian, had a project in her library, which was to throw out some books, quite a few that they had weeded, and they needed to be moved so that the space could be used for books that the library needed to retain or acquire. The law students at the time were, it was the end of summer. This was about a week before high school was going to start again. I was a high school student, 15, and so Marian and the dean were talking, and Dean Stevens said, "Well, I'll get you 4 boys from the neighborhood to come over and do that for you, that work for you." I was one of them. His son was another, and 2 of our friends. So I spent my first introduction to law librarianship was hauling all these filthy, dirty books out and throwing them in the dumpster for about a week. And then, of course, I needed to return to school and did as a high school student. The following summer, Marian's chief assistant, Viola Bird, telephoned me and said, "Pat, I'm Viola Bird. Do you remember me?" And of course I did. She was somebody I'd met the previous summer. And she said, "We're looking for someone to work about 3/4 time during the summer, doing work at the circulation desk, as a desk attendant, but also filing loose leaves, putting out supplements to various sets in the library, pocket parts as we used in those days to keep law books often up to date, things of that sort, basically anything I ask you to do. Would you like the job?" Well, I was 16 at that point, and that was sort of the age where the rite of passage was that you got some sort of a summer job. My friends were looking for them, and here I had one just fall right in my lap. So of course, I immodestly said I'd be delighted to work for the library. And so I did, and that went along. I was between my junior and senior year in high school at that point. And so when time came to go back to high school, I quit the library and indeed did that. Lo and behold, somewhere along the way, they were having problems recruiting students, and apparently I had not botched anything at the circulation desk. So I was contacted again. Would I be interested in coming back part-time, sort of as a student assistant? And that was the beginning of what was another decade of working for the law library in various capacities. I started off as a high school and then college student. I actually wasn't going to the University of Washington. I was going nearby to Seattle U, but that didn't have any problems. And so I worked in the library, and full-time during the summer and part-time, as most students do, during the academic year. And doing all the, whatever needed to be done, and logging a lot of time in the circulation desk and that type of role. So I was a typical student assistant, much like, I've worked in my own libraries in the years that I was active in the profession. Learned a great deal. I had probably in the process moved every book in the place in those years at least 2 or 3 times. So I knew where everything was, surprisingly. And that was a skill that was sort of handy to have. When people were looking for things, I could go find it pretty readily, and was pretty successful at that. And I knew all the shelving tricks, so I knew how to look around if the book was not where it was supposed to be. I'd find it on the next shelf or something like that. I knew all those tricks, and was able to, as I said, impress a lot of people, and that I could produce the books that the faculty member or whoever, the student maybe wanted. And so they thought I was pretty good at that. And so that was how it happened. Now, as I said earlier, I decided to go to law school, and I continued in this student role as a student desk attendant and doer of whatever needed to be done that was assigned to me when I started law school. But I was thinking in terms of being a regular lawyer, a practitioner, the more traditional use of the degree. But lo and behold, I got to my 3rd year, and by then Dean Stevens had retired as dean and had been succeeded by a man named Leon Tunks. And Leon Tunks, Dean Tunks, had noted that I was, right there often in the library, and he'd heard, I guess, good things about me. And he came to me as basically a friend, an older, somebody that wanted to offer some suggestions. And he said, Pat, you seem to be pretty good in the library. Have you ever thought of becoming a law librarian? And I said, well, I thought about it because I had seen some of Marion Gallagher's law librarianship students, and I'd gotten to know them. But, I was sort of thinking maybe still the traditional use of the law degree. But the dean said, I'm a dean, and I know from other deans how difficult it is to find really good law librarians. He said, a lot of the people who are law librarians at that time were foreign lawyers who had come to this country around the period of World War II. They were fleeing the Nazis, or if it was post-World War II, they were, moving on because of whatever, and coming to the United States. Well, these were people often who had practiced law in their original countries in Europe, but were not able to qualify to practice law in the United States at that time, or if they were able to qualify for the bar, the cultural and language skills made it difficult for them to work as lawyers in the normal sense. So they had gone into law librarianship, and there were quite a few of these people who were the law librarians at the time, but they were nearing and beginning to retire. And Dean Tunks pointed out that the opportunities for a young guy who gets the right credentials and works hard as a law librarian are really pretty much unlimited. And I thought about that, and so I decided to go on to school. As I said, it took me 2 years to obtain the degree at the time that was offered, the Master of Law Librarianship. And just by chance, at the University of Washington, Marion Gallagher had inherited a course that had been developed by her predecessor, Arthur Beardsley, in about 1939 or 40. Marion had succeeded him a few years later. and for the rest of her career, further developed this course for lawyers who wanted to become law librarians. And what she did was, of course, admit me to her program. I had to, basically, Marion had to admit whoever was going to be in it, as well as the graduate school, and I fortunately was able to get admitted there. And so I continued. Now, I had been living at home with my parents, and they were supporting me. And while that was wonderful, I felt that I was in my mid-20s at that point, and it was just not appropriate that I continue to ask my father to continue to support me. After all, I had 5 siblings, and although one of my sisters was about to get married at that point, the others were much younger, and you know, I just felt that I should be able to be independent. So I talked with Dean Tunks, and I said, Dean, you know, I really have one major concern about continuing in school, and that is that I not have to live at home and be supported by my parents. I just felt that it was time for me to move on a little bit. So lo and behold, he said, well, we need a reference librarian in the evening. The American Bar Association had been pushing for more of this to be developed in law schools. And he said, I will arrange for a half-time reference librarian job. You have the law degree, you're eligible to be appointed as a librarian in the law library. So lo and behold, he came up with it. And then he asked me outright, he said, what are your fellow classmates getting when they go with the firms? And so I told him the figure. And he said, would half of that, since it's a half-time job, be adequate? Well, it was adequate and more than adequate. So I was able to pursue my studies, work as a working law librarian, mostly in the evening, and during the summer we didn't need night reference. So I just supplemented the people in the library and worked whatever job the management thought needed to be done. So it was a wonderful experience. I really enjoyed it, and I really learned a great deal, both in the classroom. I mean, Marion's courses were so excellent. The library school courses were good too, although I found my working schedule a nice release from the academics. So the combination was pretty well suited to me. And it was after that when I finished up the following academic year, I had met my wife the previous summer, a wife-to-be, and we were courting and dating and so on. And then I had to go for a job, and I did so, and ended up the following year working with a wonderful director, E Kehoe, and a great mentor at the University of Houston. But of course, Carol was in Seattle, and I guess normally she would be a little bit down about that. I was too, but I had said, why don't you come down and visit at Christmas? And so early October, I called her up one day and I said, why don't you make your plans to come on down at Christmas and see me here in Houston? And she said she would, and did. And when she came at Christmas, we got engaged and we were married the following summer. So that's sort of where that is.
Some years ago, in a Law Library Journal article about mentors, you said that you had had 4. One, of course, was Marion Gallagher. The others were Marion's chief deputy, Viola Bird, your director when you were at the University of Houston, E Kehoe, and finally your director at Yale, Arthur Charpentier. All of these individuals were major figures in our profession. Could you share a few things about each?
Well, these were all very accomplished librarians, but there were also the kind of people who became very good friends of mine over the years. But in the meantime, I had the opportunity to work with them or under their directions, although it often felt like it was with, because that's the way they made it. I've already mentioned the first two, which were Marion Gallagher and Viola Bird. Marion was the head librarian at the University of Washington. Viola was the assistant. interestingly enough, they both had very different management styles, but they complemented each other very well. Marion was sort of a hands-off director. She set direction, she had a very first-rate staff, and she let them basically do what they were good at. And the result was the library was run very well, and that's what she was looking for. Viola was her everyday eyes and ears and manager of the everyday part of the library, and was really the direct supervisor of the other librarians. And so it worked out well. Well, Marion was always very friendly to me. Even before I took her courses, she knew me very well. She'd been in law school with my father, and so I was, even the day I started, she knew who the heck I was, which was good. Actually, I guess it could have been bad, but since I wasn't hopefully misbehaving, it was fine. And I would often talk with her. I'd be in the building and she'd be in early, and she was always open to just impromptu conversations. But some things she did not actively recruit me into the field. She left that to the dean. And I suspect she knew exactly what he was doing because she was very pleased. And I could just tell when I decided to apply for the library school. And I'm sure she had quite a role in that creation of that part-time job I mentioned a few minutes ago for me. Viola was the person who tended to supervise me a little more directly or indirectly because I was working as under one of the other librarians. But Viola monitored my work, even the year that I was there for just a week when I was 15. Viola is the one who assessed which of the four of us they would offer employment to and whether they would do that at all. So she had taken note of me even as early as that. Each had a very different management style, as I said, and I watched them and learned a great deal. And I saw how they did it, and I often over the years would think of that as I had to address needs in my own library. My third mentor, actually, was my first boss in my first real librarian position, and that was at the University of Houston. And I was there for 3 years with Al Coco. Al was it was like working with an older brother. Al was maybe 8, 9 years my senior, but he was a friend. He was a friend from the beginning. And I noticed immediately that Al Coco could get anything done on campus. If he had a need, the library had a need, he knew who to talk to. And he could get stuff done that the dean couldn't get done. And he told me that the way he did this was he treated all these people in the place as friends and people of importance. He said he didn't care what they did. They contributed to the university's needs, and that was good enough. So everybody knew Al Coco. He was friendly, even when he didn't need anything, and they knew that. So when he needed something, he had back channels that could take care of the need, and he worked them very skillfully and very effectively. While I was at Houston, we had 2 major projects, and Al involved me in every one of them. One was the year after I had arrived as his assistant. I was the number 2 librarian. We hosted the American Association of Law Libraries annual meeting. Now in those days, the local people did virtually all the work because there was almost no staff at headquarters in Chicago. The headquarters staff consisted of 1 person. So the local people really had to organize and manage the meeting. Al was the chair. I was designated his vice chair, along with the law librarian at Humble Oil, which is now Exxon, Dwayne Gay. And then, of course, all the librarians who worked with us at the University of Houston, there were only two others, Lala Gasaway and a woman named Marjorie Paraguay. And our staff, including the full-time people and all the students who were around in the summer, we became the local arrangements people when that meeting was held. And I watched Al work with that, and I learned a great deal, and he gave me a lot of special responsibilities. And I saw how he delegated to even the students who worked for him tremendous responsibilities, and how splendidly they were able to carry them out. So we had that. And it also, and partly because Al arranged this, I had an opportunity to address all the members of the association at a gathering in the then new law school building, and that's our second project that summer. And so I had an opportunity to become known in a way that a young, just newly minted colleague would ordinarily not have. And it was because of the circumstance of having the meeting, but more particularly having the particular boss I had and how he operated. So I learned a great deal from Al about how to manage, how to respect the people who were all around you, who were doing good jobs, and let them know you respected them, so that if you did need a favor, they were more than willing to give it to you if they could. And he once told me, Pat, the trick is to figure out who's high enough in the system to do what you need, but low enough down to, frankly, be flattered that you ask them. And that was an interesting tidbit that I used time and again during my career, very effectively, I think, because I got stuff done. My fourth mentor, rather, is Arthur Charpentier. Now, Art was the director, or librarian as he was technically called, at Yale. And when I left the University of Houston, I moved to Yale and became Art's number 2 administrator. Before I talk briefly about that, I did omit something I wanted to mention, and that was the other big project that we had that summer at the University of Houston, which was I'd been there a year. And that was, the university had built a new law center consisting of 3 buildings, one of which was the library. And we had to organize and plan for that, order furniture, order equipment, and Al was basically the administrator that the dean had asked to basically handle all that. Well, Al involved me. I was still a bachelor, so I was available, evenings and weekends, and we worked hard, but we did some fun things. And I could still remember one story. I'll tell this. Since I think I'm far enough along, I won't get fired for this. One day, we were setting up the telephone system for the law school. And in those days, it was the old traditional Centrex system, where you had all sorts of wires coming to the phone and buttons on the front that you could do certain things if you had, more than one telephone line and so on. And Al and I sat down. We didn't really know an awful lot about what we were doing, but we knew that each faculty member and each staff member would need a telephone on their desk. And we had a note, though, from the dean. John Nibel was the dean there, and John had said he needed a phone with 2 stations. Well, Al and I didn't really know what 2 stations were. We thought, well, maybe it's the second line. But, if the dean needed 2 stations, we would need 2 stations. So we just wrote the spec and we got away with it. So we had extra stations. As it turned out, all the librarians and staff in the library mostly had a multiple station phone. We used one line for library calls, and then was a private line, so you wouldn't tie up the library line if you were talking to somebody, either in business or even personal. So it worked out well. Again, so the second project was planning the building and then planning the move into it and organizing the library. And that was a tremendous experience, especially for someone who was still pretty newly minted. And years later in my profession, I had to plan libraries, and I had to move libraries in law schools. And the experience at the University of Houston was just invaluable training for what I did later in my career on several occasions. Okay, getting back to my fourth mentor, that was Art Charpentier. Art was my director at Yale, and a very different kind of administrator than any of the previous ones, as one would expect. He was still relatively hands-off, and he expected results from the staff, but allowed some discretion on how you got them. That I liked. But Art was very skilled in managing the power that was inherent in the roles he played. He did it in a very judicious, but when needed, effective manner. And he got resources for the library. He did things as a former president of AELL, with Network in the association, helped with questions and issues that had come up from behind the scenes at that point, because he was a former elected leader. And I watched him and learned a lot about the strategic management role that he played. And it was very useful over the years. I learned one thing, however, that from him that also was important. Art's background was not in academic law librarianship, but rather he had been the head librarian for many years in New York City at the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, which is a private bar association subscription library. And so when he was recruited to come to Yale, they were a little reluctant to offer him a regular faculty slot. And Art, not having been part of the academic scene, accepted without being a tenure track faculty member. And he told me years later, when I was working with him, that he thought had been a mistake, because he was a little bit felt on the outside of some of the faculty discussions. And the library needed to be both aware of those discussions and perhaps contribute to them based on what kind of resources the library might need to supply and whether they could do it. So Art had told me that, and I learned from that being not just the librarian, but also being a regular member of the faculty was very important to combine those two. And I have noted that most of my colleagues over the years have worn both hats in their respective law schools. So that was my last of the formal mentors.
Thank you, Pat. Pat, you served for 2 years as president of the Law Librarian Society of Washington, D.C., which is AALL's largest chapter. Later, you also served 1 year as president of AALL itself. For those accomplishments, as well as for many others, you are now among a relatively small number of our colleagues who received AALL's highest honor, the Marion Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award. You are also inducted into AALL's Hall of Fame. Could you talk a little bit about some of the other things you did to merit these honors?
Well, of course, in addition to the elected offices, one does a lot of things. And one of the things all of my mentors had impressed on me was, don't just sit in your office and do nothing else. Get out there, volunteer. That this organization, these colleagues, work best when they work together on things. And that is not just in your employer institution, it's in the broader profession. And I learned that from all four of them. And so when I got out there, one of the things that Al Coco, my first boss out of school, did was arrange to get me on a committee. He knew the president of AELL, so I got appointed as a member. Later, when Viola Bird was president, she arranged to have me chair a major program at her annual meeting, again, experience. So I did that sort of thing. I was occasionally on programs over the years, but I also did interesting things. When Al Coco was president, and all these things come together, I had been recently appointed the business manager for the Law Library Journal. And the Law Library Journal being the scholarly publication in our profession. But the business manager's role was to sort of do the nuts and bolts of getting it printed, getting it financed, working with advertisers directly and placing ads. And in those days, there were a lot of ads in the Law Library Journal. In fact, at the beginning, it was the only such vehicle for ads for the advertisers. But later, the ALL Spectrum developed and, as a newsletter, and started accepting ads as well. So I was handling all of that, and one of the interesting experiences as business manager, I was business manager for 18 years, was working with all these people that I knew from vendors on, not as a customer, but as someone working with them on ads for the journal. And I got to know them in an interesting way, and that was always very fascinating. And I got to know their quirks too, where they wanted their ads placed. And my idea was, like in the library, you want to have the people that use it leave happy. I tried to work with the vendors, and they liked that, and we did some interesting things. And that was always good. But I did have an interesting experience along the way, and that was that the journal was getting to be extremely expensive to have produced, and the association was looking to see if perhaps there were ways to keep the quality up but reduce the production costs. And so the person who was the editor at the time, a woman named Lorraine Culpa, who was a law firm librarian in Buffalo, I think at the time, she and I, she was the editor, I was the business manager, we had to figure out about our printer. At the time, we were paying upwards of over $100 for each page just to have the typeset. Those were rates that were established in the era when typesetting was a very highly skilled, labor-intensive kind of operation. And the people who did it were heavily unionized and reasonably well compensated. So we were paying a lot for production in such things as setting the type for the pages. And so we decided to see if we could look around and find out if other printers would give us a better price. And how do we do that? Well, I had, as I said, friends at the American University at the time who worked in purchasing, and I said, I need a favor. How do you do this? And I remember the assistant head of purchasing at AAU explained what I would want to know and helped me draft a questionnaire, standardized bid form for various printers to bid on our job. And that way we got apples and apples instead of apples, peaches, and oranges, a different version of everything from everyone. So it was that we were able to compare it. And the printer we finally selected was considerably cheaper. Instead of a little over $100, every page was going to cost $16.50 for typesetting, no matter what was on it. And of course, if you had a lot of tables and graphics, the cost would go well above $100 with the original printer. So Lorraine and I visited this printer, and we asked outright, why is it that you're so much cheaper? You sort of wonder what you're going to get, trouble or a bargain. And the owner explained, a man named George Gard, and the printer got the bid, but he explained that what they had done is they had modernized, and they were using offset presses, and the plates or the devices used to print the pages were being produced by computer. This was the beginning of that. I had known, Lorraine had known, there had been some strife in the newspaper industry as the highly paid, highly skilled linotype operators were being replaced by people who behind computer keyboards. And George said that with the computer, the operator does not have to know anything except how to type. And if the operator can type 75 words a minute, they can set 75 words a minute of type for this system. Whereas with a linotype system, not only are they highly compensated, but a very good linotype operator using their techniques could set maybe 16 words a minute versus, 70 for a fast typist. So there was the saving was from a variety of changes in the system, in the technology. And it explained to us why the price was so low, so we recommended to the executive board that we give the contract to Western Newspaper, which was the name of the company we were dealing with. And they were the publisher for many years, and costs were in fact considerably reduced on producing the journal as a result. So that was another one of those interesting things I got to do for the association. And I did a lot of other things. I was involved with local arrangements, originally with Houston, the meeting in Houston, and years later with 3 other meetings. I happened to be here in DC, and it comes here every few years at the time, and so I would get involved in that. While I was here, also the Law Librarian Society, of which I did a lot of things. I'd been president. I edited their newsletter for several years first, and other things. They decided to celebrate their 50th anniversary of their founding by having a mini national meeting. And so I got involved with that with some wonderful colleagues, many from firms who I'd known, but really got to know working with them, Kate Martin, Carolyn Ahern, and others. I better be careful naming names. I might inadvertently leave somebody off and get myself in trouble, but they were particularly close on this, and we put on this thing, and it was a lot of interesting experience. So those were the sorts of things that I guess years later some of the people that run the awards process decided I should be recognized for. And I'm truly very flattered and very honored to have been singled out for some of the recognitions I have gotten over the years.
In addition to everything that you've mentioned, you've contributed greatly to the development of library scholarship, both through your contribution through the Law Library Journal that you just discussed, as well as through your own writings. What impact do you think scholarship has had on the profession, and which pieces or authors do you think have influenced you most?
Well, again, as I just mentioned, you start naming names, you can get yourself into trouble because you leave somebody off who ought not to be left off. So I'm going to be a little bit cautious here. Scholarship, I think, is important. It's how we communicate to each other in a different way what it is we do, or what it's all about, or what we might do. It's an exchange of ideas. It's also a way to become known by your colleagues. There is some really first-rate stuff in the journal. The ALL spectrum has developed very well. There are shorter pieces than that. I find them just fascinating often to read. Sometimes I will contact the writer afterwards privately by email and comment, and almost universally they're very pleased to hear those comments. I mean, I won't comment if I found a piece I didn't like. It's after the fact, there's no point. And I don't actually find many that would even fit near that situation. But I think it is a way for people to move out of again, from behind their own desks and make another contribution to the profession, to help educate people, help create ideas, share ideas, begin dialogues, whatever. And it's also, frankly, another way that those who have to select tomorrow's leaders in the field can help to identify who those people just might be. Because somebody who is doing writing in the journals or in the spectrum, these are people you take note of, I think. And it helps identify people who do think beyond the ends of their immediate jobs in a broader, more strategic sense. And these are good people. So it contributes to the betterment of everybody to be involved in this. The writer gets a lot of experience, is able to share his or her views with a wide variety of colleagues. and become known in the process, and there's a lot of good to that. Now, you asked Michelle about some of the legendary, I guess that's my term, writers. Historically, Fred Hicks, who for many years was the director or law librarian, or librarian as he technically was called, at Yale. Anything he has written, and it's all there in the literature. You go on to back copies of the journals and you'll find it, or onto Hein Online, and you can find all of those there quite readily. Fred Hicks is somebody, if you're looking for a nominee for Scholar of the Year, in my opinion, Hicks would fit that category. Arthur Beardsley, Marion Gallagher's predecessor at the University of Washington, is another. Now, Arthur was not trained as a librarian. He became a law librarian back in the second decade or so of the 20th century. He was a practicing lawyer. He went to work for the University of Washington and was appointed librarian. And so he learned the business of being a librarian by being a librarian. But he wrote extensively. Not so much in the technical library, and I mean, he probably didn't know what catalogers were all about. I don't even know. Well, I know they had a catalog and they had catalog librarians, but I suspect he left that to them. They were the experts. So he tended to write about legal topics, sort of scholarly things that wouldn't necessarily appeal to every practitioner, but they were more appeal to the academic lawyers and to other faculty. He enjoyed legal history, especially focused on the legal history of the state in which he lived and worked, which was Washington State. And I have found his writings over the years fascinating to read. So you ask, who I might think of. I'm reluctant to mention current people, but there is one, that's Bob Baring out in California, who's now the retired director at the University of California, Boal Hall. He's still on faculty. He's one. I would mention Frank Hodek. Frank was the editor of the Law Library Journal for, I think, about 12 years until recently. He has now left as director of the library. The dean asked him to serve as associate dean for faculty affairs in the law school, and he has done that now for a number of years. But he keeps involved in law librarianship and in our circles. In fact, he's involved in this project that we're involved in today with this interview. But Frank has done an awful lot of very interesting stuff. When he was editor of the journal, he really worked with authors, and I'm sure their results showed his contributions as well. But he did stuff in his own right, both in journal articles, especially histories of our profession. ALL passed its 100th year at that point. There were a lot of things around that and leading up to it. About all sorts of interesting topics having to do with the history of law librarianship and the people who were part of it in those eras. Frank has done a great deal of that sort of thing. So in fear of leaving off a lot of other very capable and people who would be appropriately named in response to this question, I think I will cut my losses and limit it to the ones I've mentioned.
Thank you, Pat Kehoe, for allowing us to visit with you today and for taking these few moments to share so much about yourself and our profession. Before we conclude, though, is there anything that you would like to add to this interview?
No. Really, I think I've said more than enough. I will, however, urge those of us in the profession, those in the profession who are perhaps new or considering entering it, that it's been, for me, a wonderful way to make a living. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. I have been involved in activities of various sorts. I have run my own library for quite a few years. I think I was successful. I didn't get fired because I had tenure at some point. He probably couldn't fire me, but I truly, it was a great experience. As a administrator, I've worked with deans in law school, and I got involved in American, even in university level opportunities. I was involved for over 20 years with the benefits package that employees get at American U. I was on a committee at various points appointed by the university's faculty senate. At one point I had run out my terms there, and the two vice presidents cooked up a way of getting me back on the committee as their appointee for a while, and then I was again eligible from the Senate, and so I got stretched out to over 20 years, and it was a wonderful experience on the campus. Another time, smoking laws were changing in the District of Columbia, and the provost asked me to chair a special task force to implement those laws. And our main job was not deciding if people could smoke or not smoke in the buildings. The law said they could not. The trick was to bring people along in such a way that they would want to cooperate and make it work. And we were able to do that. And I got to work with faculty and staff from across the campus on that project and others. And then the last year, I had been the law school's representative to the faculty senate for many years. And I was willing to do it. Many of my colleagues were delighted that I was willing to do it. So frankly, I was sort of like having a guaranteed job in that sense. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I got into the leadership, and the last year, my colleagues elected me the chair of the Senate, which is the main officer. And I remember Neil Kerwin, who was the provost at that time, and a good friend, and who's now the president of the university, and as far as I can tell, a very first-rate one. Neil came to me and he said, "Pat, what a wonderful way to cap your career." I mean, Neil knew I was in my last year. I was going to retire. The dean, of course, knew it. And I can still remember how pleased he was that I was going to have this opportunity. And it's ironic. I came to the university 30 years before I retired. Like everybody else, I didn't know too many people. I wasn't, involved in the leadership stuff other than the library. But over the 30 years, I got more and more involved and got more and more known. My last meeting, the day I walked out of there into retirement, was as a participant, as the chair of the faculty senate in the board of trustees. And so I started sort of at the bottom and ended up at the top. And even though after that meeting, which was in the late morning, the dean and faculty, quite a few of us, had a wonderful lunch at a nearby place. My real last official meeting was at the trustees. Although I did, after lunch, I came back, convened all the staff of the library who were available, and then personally thanked them for having made me look good for 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat.